All right. Thank you so much for coming tonight, everybody. And I hope you will enjoy what I'm going to show you. But first, let me introduce myself. My name is Michael O'Connor, and I'm an astrologer, and I also do numerology. I weave them. I'm what's called a life coach astrologer. A life coach astrologer, or an astrologer, really covers a lot of ground. What we do, we can be deemed a coach, a guide, a counselor, a mentor, a translator. What an astrologer ideally does is translate. If I tell you you have Venus square Jupiter, it's not going to help a ton. You're going to be in a land of wondering what does that mean. So that's not what we're supposed to do. There may be moments when I'll say, oh, well, you have the sun in Cancer and the moon's in Capricorn, and by the way, it's a full moon. You'll go away remembering that, and that could be fun. There's an element of entertainment in astrology. It's just this sort of gee whiz factor. However, it can get very deep, and it can go as deep as you probably can go. It's very profound. It's beautiful in terms of how it works, and why it works is very interesting to me. I'm keen on that cosmology, that worldview. In other words, the worldview that astrology rests upon is not the mainstream materialistic model, which is fine for the world in its economic platform. Really, engineering and just the good old-fashioned marketplace, etc. But it dips into a spiritual consciousness as well. The notion that we're souls incarnate. From a purely materialistic scientific worldview, that's not true. There is no such thing. And that's a story that's emerged now since the scientific revolution emerged. We need empirical proof. Actually, astrology in a lot of ways provides some empirical proof. It proves at least that there's more to reality than the material model, circumstantially, by virtue of seeing who a person is, where they're at in their life, what their nature is, what constitutes aspects of their destiny, etc. Of course, along the way, we also have free will. And that's an important factor, which I'm going to discuss as we go along. So, yes, astrology is a very sophisticated art, really. And it's not done the same by any two people. There may be similarities. There's styles. There's various schools in astrology. I'm in what's called the humanistic school. And the humanistic school of astrology is very person-centered. Moreover, we're looking at who you are initially versus merely and simply predicting the future, which brings it into a type of fortune telling. And astrologers would assert that while there is a valid aspect to wanting to know what probably is going to happen, we're also wanting to present a much more sophisticated overview of how it works, and there's many more types of questions, and that's what I'm going to share with you tonight. So you get a peek into the deeper layers of how it works, and what it can do for you specifically is what I want you to take home. And I do readings, I do them in person, and I do them over the phone or Skype. I work full-time doing this, and so if anybody's at all interested to have a reading tomorrow, just come and see me afterwards. Or I have some business cards over there if you want to do it on the phone. And in both cases, the sessions are recorded. And invariably, whether in person or by phone, I'll be sending you a package. The recording, your chart, a report which gives you a translation of the details of the chart. That's what an amateur astrologer would do. They would just tell you, oh, you have Venus in Aries in the 3rd house, and you're left wondering what that means. Well, that's a highly unnecessary type of reading. It's very beginner. When you get more advanced, you're not doing that. I'm actually reading a book right now by a fellow who's a psychologist. He's a depth psychologist, and he began to study astrology. And he realized this is a tool for depth psychologists. And astrologers aren't trained specifically that way, but by the reading process, the study process of astrology educates you at a deep level. What you're learning is about psycho-spirituality. Meaning, if you approach a person, if you're a psychologist or a counselor, and you purely approach a person as a personality, and you don't understand that they're a soul, you're going to either miss the point, or possibly even cause damage, or only go so far. So it's an amazing thing. You can go to counselors and psychologists, and I'm not suggesting you won't get benefit, but an astrologer can see a lot of stuff like that, just right now. And wow, I can see that. And I've had people come to me who have gone to counselors, and they said to me, "You've done more for me in an hour than in months of counseling." However, I wish to offer that I would also be the type of astrologer to send you to a counselor if I thought that was a good idea. So it sounds contradictory to say that, but now that you're up to speed, you really get a sense of who I am, what my troubles are, then I might say, at this point, I might recognize that you might be better off to go and have a deeper counsel process. Okay, so it can go both ways like that. We'll have room for questions a little later. So if you have any, but unless you wish to, it feels compelling to ask a question or make a comment, just hold it. Unless you feel compelled. Would you like to?
Well, I just wanted clarity is after you've looked at the chart.
After I've looked at the chart. Oh, yes, of course. Well, I have to see your chart.
Yeah.
Yes, and to do an astrology chart, thank you. To do an astrology chart, I basically need your birthday, year, place, and time is ideal, but I can do an astrology chart without the time, by the way. The picture's not as clear, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, the time of birth in astrology is rather significant, but there's a lot of factors that you don't need the time because of the relationship that the planets share to one another. What you're learning with the time is the angles of the chart, which are very important, but again, you can get a remarkable amount of information without the time at all. So I like to compare astrology to like the iPhones in the respect that there's a lot of apps to it. And just that world we live in of many apps, this is the translation. I didn't want to spend too much time showing you all the apps because the point is a phone has a lot of applications. And when people approach astrology, it's a rather sophisticated creature on one hand, but it's also presented in a pop fashion on the other. It's presented in a kind of fun, playful, kind of comic strip sort of manner. You put it in with the funnies and the crossword because the scientific establishment has decided that it doesn't work because it has assumed a position of a type of authority which is actually really sort of a protracted deception that it has done away with and proven that doesn't work. It's more the baby that got thrown out with the bathwater a long time ago, and that to this day has caused its own forms of problems. Those problems can be called our existential crisis of humanity, that here we are with all the abundance that we could ever have dreamed of, but we're still suffering, we're fighting, we're polluting the rivers and the air, and there's toxicity everywhere, and we have Monsanto, and we have every form of corruption, etc., etc. So now, not to say that that wasn't there before, but the answer basically is that all this modern technology and science has solved our problems. There remains this notion that it will in time, but it could also be the very thing that destroys us. So we're in a spiritual crisis right now in humanity, in the human family. And there's many religions that are doing their work, which is wonderful. And I'm not suggesting that they shouldn't exist, but some of them are also, holding a strong position where, based on their staunch dogmatic beliefs, then backed by technology, we're in trouble, right? Whether we're talking about a desperate act of sending a nuclear bomb in a certain direction because we finally had enough, right? You understand what I'm talking about. So astrology comes in, and one of the things at a very core level it does is it reintroduces a spiritual science. A science. So that's the beauty of it when you get into the science aspect. So now with this app image here, this is just meant to represent that there's many ways we can look at the chart. So people sometimes will come to me and they'll say, okay, just do it. I'm like, well, is there anything in particular you'd like to know? And they don't always. They sort of more or less assume that there's a certain thing you do and you basically predict the future and that's it. And the answer is no, that's not true. We can go into many directions. We can look at self-awareness, health. Sometimes people want to have a character sketch of their newborn baby. Business questions, which are linked to timing. Sometimes events occur in people's life, they'd like to expand upon that, which can be linked to turning points. That word destiny sneaks into the picture. Destiny represents a balance between our character and we would say you're destined to be fully who you are. Woven within that statement is what would be described as self-actualization. To be conscious of who we are. Now people will say, well, I'm a conscious being. And one would say, yes, I appreciate that. But just having consciousness doesn't strictly make one conscious. As a matter of fact, it's a very, in a certain kind of statement. We have consciousness. But what I'm suggesting here is, there's a riddle that comes out of neuroscience that says this. And it actually lends itself to other disciplines as well. Linguistics and semantics in particular. And it suggests the following. If we assume that we see things as they are, then we're sleeping because we only see things as we are. We see things as we are conditioned, as according to our nature. So if we were to talk about, if I were to ask the class, okay class, I want you to tell me a little story about what I'm doing right here today. Okay, just give me a 100-word small essay, right? Just a quick little download. Well, guess what? You'd each have a slightly different version of the story, wouldn't you? So it's this basic, obvious thing I'm trying to tell you. It's just a celebration of that we're ultimately subjective and our objectivity is relative. So all of which is a celebration more than anything of your individuality. That's what I'm mostly trying to get to. Rather than think of us as homogenous, all the same, numbers, shall we say. Astrology, in the positive sense of what I'm saying, it celebrates you as an individual. On one hand, who are you? And secondly, woven within that is a process of bringing identification to who you are, where you're at in your life, where you're coming from. That could be both your past, but also what motivates you, where you're at now in your life, where you're going to, which is a direction according to a destiny theme, and what's going on now, or what is described as what's next. So who you are, where you're coming from, where you're going to, where you're at, what's next, is one basic way of looking at the chart. That's called a life reading, which I'll get back to. So again, you can come and I can show you. Might be just purely interested in, Michael, tell me about my career. What does it say about who I am and where I'm at and all of that? Then the question of education could come up. Sometimes people want to sign a marriage contract or a business contract, so when to sign. Sometimes it's about where should I move? Is there one place better than another? And there are. You have every single town has its own astrology, by the way. And there's also a principle in astrology where we measure the longitude and latitude of a location will work better for some than others. So it's rather interesting. You'll see how, some people come to a town, it works wonderfully. Some people, they come and it should work, but it doesn't. They don't last, they find they're on their way for whatever reason, and it could be deemed the timing of their life, it's true, but it could be that they just don't quite mesh with the town. And it's not that they're bad, it's not that the town's bad, it doesn't create a nice relationship. So there's a whole dynamic of relationship that emerges. We can look at current cycles, past lives. Very interesting. I'll say to people, I'll talk to them about their past lives, and it's uncanny where they'll recognize that I think you're right, or they'll feel resonance with it very strongly. I was mentioning to this one lady in particular, I said, you were definitely from Russia. I'm quite psychic. I don't lean on being psychic. As an astrologer, I'm very intuitive. There's a psychic component, but the astrology presents a scientific model and platform which gives me an increased level of objectivity. There's no complete objectivity. I remain the interpreter, but there is an increased level of objectivity, which is somewhat helpful. In fact, an astrology chart has been described as a mathematical crystal ball. But we're careful not to want to bring in that pseudo-scientific or pseudo-psychological component of, robes and handkerchiefs on the head and, big rings on the finger and fortune-telling images. Fine as that may be on its own ground. I'm not saying somebody should do that. Go for it. It's fine. And these fortune tellers may have wisdom to share. But astrology introduces a much more sophisticated process and so forth. So we can get into questions of what constitutes being authentic in who we are, what constitutes being self-actualized. Tell me more about my relationships. Sometimes woven within the reading can be vision, inspiration, and strategy in a very practical sense, timing and when. So I like to work with people that way as well. And the good old-fashioned real estate, when to sell, when will it sell, is this a good time? But good old-fashioned past, present, future, and insight wraps up the whole thing. So I just want to quickly go through and review some of, and there's even more. So the title of this presentation is actually the title of a book I'm writing, which is meant to be an umbrella book showing that all the different types of readings that I do and which are available in astrology. And it probably won't encompass all of the types of approaches one might take, because some people are using astrology to gamble. They're using astrology to watch sports, what their signs are. So there's all kinds of things. They're making, calculated guesses and using statistical analysis based on signs and stuff. So I don't go into those areas, but it's possible. So this is the app land. And there's, by the way, many systems of astrology. I'm a Western astrologer. Western astrology is based on specifically the sunlight, the seasons of the year. So solstices and equinoxes divide the year naturally. And so Western astrology is not strictly linked to, or it does not defer to, the constellations. That's a very important thing to understand. A lot of people think, well, the constellations and astrology, they go together, and the answer is yes and no. Because the season of the year is the sign. So, for example, we're in Scorpio time. If you know anything about Scorpio, you're in the dark time.
Yeah.
You see that? And the Scorpio there's no we all have the 12 signs in us, we would say, and so there's no negative or better. However, I kind of like the dark time. I like the inward. But that said, it is dark and mysterious and enigmatic, and it has a little stinger to it at worst. If you think about it, it's pinchy, cold. It's not that warm, balmy, or pretty Libra time, which is all colorful, or even earlier Virgo time, which is the last. That would be the last month of the summer, and so forth. You get into this. The signs are more what we see. And so Western astrology is much more linked to the almanacs that way, where other systems of astrology do defer to the stars. And in Western astrology, we do have an overlay. We want to know, where are the fixed stars in a chart, possibly. There's many overlays we can bring in, but I'll show you that in a few minutes. So there's many applications.